Joining me today is Dr. Andrew Rojecki, and I discuss the American psyche and how events like 9/11 and the recession of 2008 impacted how we see ourselves and how we portray ourselves in the media. Dr. Rojecki is the author of a 2016 book published by Johns Hopkins University called The Politics of Insecurity. Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach. I'm joined today by my guest, Andrew Rojecki. We're going to talk about the politics of insecurity. Dr. Rojecki is the author of 3 books on political communication, and we're very happy to have him here today. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you.
Andrew, your last book, published in 2016 by Johns Hopkins University Press, was called The Politics of Insecurity. Tell us what that refers to.
I think that refers in general to the sort of change in the perspective that Americans have about their sort of day-to-day hopes and perspectives on politics. The main argument of the book is that Americans have been confronted with a series of problems that they're simply not used to addressing, I think. Mm-hmm. You know, primarily, I think, you know, when I think of that, I think of 9/11, you know, the sense that the country can be attacked. There's something that has not happened since the War of 1812.
That's interesting. That never occurred to me. So you think there's a, of course, 9/11 would, even if it happened every 10 years, would have a huge psychological impact on the country. But you're saying that there's a greater impact because we've just haven't dealt with that in I think there's an economist who called that a black swan event. In other words, you know, it's just something you just don't expect. And when that happens, you're so disoriented that it just opens up psychological reactions and certain incentives, political incentives for certain kinds of exploitation. So that's one of the things that happened. I think also the Great Recession of 2008. I think is another development that had its origins, as did 9/11, in conditions that sort of intruded from the outside. Mm-hmm. Well, so let's look at 9/11 for a second. What are some of the the results of that you think are more attributed to this psychological reaction than what we might expect to just, for instance, let's say we look at the Iraq invasion of Kuwait, right? When George Bush Sr. Responded to that, we were comparing that to Vietnam, and so we kind of knew how to deal with this. And he said, well, we're going to make sure we don't get stuck in there. We're going to have an end. We're going to end this in a reasonable amount of time, and so we approached it with this sense of familiarity almost, right? Which you're saying we didn't have with 9/11. So how did that change it for us?
Well, I think what happened is that I think that there was an event that took place that we often attribute. When we're attacked, we think of nation states attacking us, and here this was an ideologically charged movement,
right.
And this was a war against terror, which is a war against a tactic, and so there was a category mismatch between what happened and how we responded.
Right.
We responded in the traditional way. We attacked a country. We attacked 2 countries. Yeah. And of course, the movement just spread from there. But because under conditions of dislocation, psychological dislocation, and under black swan events, we sort of turned to elites, political elites who provide guidance, and of course the sort of patriotism that takes place under those conditions. Again, you're sort of clinging to sort of traditional beliefs. I mean, my own friends who, far from being patriotic, suddenly started putting up flags in their windows right after 9/11. Right. So it was kind of a universally felt event, I think, and that leads sometimes to bad decisions.
Yeah, well, and it was a very close election, of course, and a lot of us wondered what would have happened had the election gone the other way before that event happened. Would we have had a different response? Did you entertain that at all, or you're just looking at the?
You're talking about the election of George W. Bush and Kerry,
right?
John Kerry. Yeah, I mean, I think there's considerable research that showed. I mean, here's John Kerry, who fought in Vietnam, and compared to George Bush, who wasn't an Air National Guard, but
Right.
mysteriously disappeared from his position. And people, believed the canard that Kerry was a coward and Bush was the hero. As that outcome can only be explained by, I think, very extreme psychological circumstances, I think.
And what role does the media play in this, particularly the news media?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that, especially since the growth of the broadcast spectrum, there are incentives for media companies to get smaller shares that are economically viable, and so it's to their incentives to sort of purify their products ideologically to draw certain kinds of audiences, which are then sold to advertisers because they're made up of certain predictable demographic categories, and they're more valuable. So there are economic incentives to sort of do the slicing and dicing that sort of exacerbates all of this.
That's interesting because it's sort of going in the opposite direction that we went in between 1900 and 1950, where all of the news outlets, the newspapers, were trying to sell themselves as objective sources of news, covering both sides of the story because they were trying to broaden their readership and broaden their ability to get advertisers. And so what you're saying now is we're sort of, it sounds like you're arguing that we're kind of returning to a partisan press where each point of view has its own outlet, and the outlets are catering to those audiences. Am I following you?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think I think in the 19th century we had partisan press until we had the great waves of immigration to large cities, and then, as you said, the press was incentivized not because of any sort of great civic impulse, but to maximize their audiences, and of course they didn't want to offend anyone.
Yeah. I think Habermas says they were relieved of the burden of their consciences or something.
I think that's a very efficient way of putting it.
Yeah. So I mean, let's look at some examples of this. I mean, did you look at particular media outlets and categorize them at all? Or?
Well, just to give you one example, and this sort of dovetails into just the way that our political ideologies are sort of organized. I compared, for example, these two movements that sort of arose during the 2000s, the Tea Party movement and the Occupy movement. The Tea Party movement was very media savvy, and it was also, I think, advantaged by its sort of the tendency among conservatives to demand loyalty and deference to authority. There's like considerable amount of research on moral impulses that sort of separate liberals and conservatives. And conservatives, as compared to liberals, are motivated more, I think, by deference to authority. Mm-hmm. So they had a much more disciplined political message, and of course they had an outlet in Fox News that sort of maintained their discipline. Fox News even sponsored some of their events. The Occupy movement was difficult to analyze because it was very distrustful of the media as well as other politicals, as well as other institutions, and so they sort of turned their backs. I think they were rightfully, I think, concerned about the way that they would be covered, and consequently their movement, I think, to some extent foundered because of that.
Yeah. You also talked about the economic recession, 2008. Tell us a little bit about how we reacted to that, according to your analysis.
Well, I think that that those two movements kind of signaled the election of 2016, which everyone was surprised by. And I think that even had Hillary Clinton won, I think she would have won by a smaller margin, and people would have been wondering, well, why was the election so close?
Mm-hmm. So we'd still be asking the same questions.
I think so. Yeah. And so even though Trump won by 77,000 votes, and now we're trying to figure out whether that was done, whether that was due to fake news and various kinds of sort of moral panics. I think that's an example of a moral panic. I think we should be looking under the sort of structural circumstances that led both Trump and Bernie Sanders, I think, to become the most popular figures
Well, take us down that path. What, you know, how did we get there?
Well, I think you had, I think a couple of things happening. I mean, I think part of it had to do with the erosion of the manufacturing sector. I think if you look at the electoral map, Trump gained sort of surprise wins in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, I think.
I'd say they were shocking wins, but yes,
Yeah.
go ahead, yeah.
And those were areas that had, you know, that were really affected in major ways by the erosion of the manufacturing sector.
Yeah.
And if you look at the sort of, you know, prototypical Trump supporter, kind of older white male,
Right,
these were the people that whose incomes had been most affected by globalization and the offshoring of jobs. And a certain amount of pride in the way that they were raised, in the time that they were raised, I think kind of led to the sort of, first of all, to the sort of insecurity, and then the sort of following resentment and anger, I think. And I think on the side of the Democrats, I mean, they had kind of an insurgent candidate as well, Bernie Sanders, but he was, that was also a surprise, by the way.
Well, and you know, when you think about it, in certain categorical ways, Sanders had some things in common with Trump.
He did. They had two different remedies. Trump wanted to return to make America great again, kind of a reactionary, kind of a utopia of the past.
Yeah.
Whereas I think Sanders wanted kind of a European model. He wanted to sort of extend the safety net so people could feel more secure.
Yeah. Well, it was an interesting surprise. Do you have any suggestion on you know, where you think we should look for this to go in the next election? Is this going to keep amping up? We're going to get more extreme candidates. Where do you see it going?
You know, it's really hard to say. I mean, I think that right now, you know, because we have kind of a reactionary politics right now. You see a reaction on the other side as well, and maybe predictably, it's being led by women and now children.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So you have a reaction on the part of women in the Me Too movement, and I think right after Trump was elected, I think because of his reputation, I think it energized women, who, by the way, are a very large voting bloc. And now we have these kids from this Florida high school and have now energized their generation, I think. And so I think the midterm elections will give us a clue as to where things are going. The Democrats, though, still don't have a message. That's and they, you know, that which sort of continues the pattern from 2016 and before.
Well, so, and what about the message side of this? Trump was very good at you know, focusing on just one or two things: build a wall, make America great again. It seemed like every time we saw Hillary, she had this list of issues that she was raising. What's your take on that?
Well, I think if you're a reactionary, I think that, you know, it's much easier to sort of formulate a political message the way that Trump did. He knew that immigration was a hot button issue, and he kept on harping on it. And I don't think any of the people that voted for him really believed that he would build a wall. It became a symbol. It became a symbol of, making America great again, which was essentially trying to reformulate or return the country to some sort of earlier golden age. Clinton's message was, as you said, it was scattered because she still, I think, was dealing with identity politics, various groups that had been discriminated against, and putting together that particular coalition without any particular goal in mind. And I still think that the party is afflicted by that problem today.
Yeah, it actually probably goes back to the reaction to the '68 convention and the rules that they put in place for '72 that sort of dissolved the authority of the party bosses, right?
I think that's right.
Yeah. What about the framing that goes on with the news media here? What, you know, do you see, you mentioned that they're appealing to more and more specialized audiences, if I'm interpreting that correctly. Is that all that's driving this? I mean, we also have the fact that 90% of the media are owned by 6 parent corporations.
Well, it's interesting. I saw an interview with the father, one of the kids that was killed in Florida, and he was being interviewed on Fox News, and the host asked him a question about gun control, and the father was indignant. He said, you know, what you're doing, you know, you're asking a question that's just polarizing us. You know, you just want to amp up ratings. I think there's an incentive for the media to get that kind of 2 minutes hate, the way that George Orwell would put it, so they can get this sort of feeling of emotional outrage and then catharsis. And there's very little incentive to sort of build a politics that would sort of reconcile these conflicting parties.
Now, you know, when we say the media, of course, it's a reification that is actually misleading in and of itself, right? Obviously, there's outlets that people can go to get different types of information, get deeper information. Do you think that we're just being less responsible as citizens because we're not looking deeper into these things and we're not demanding more, or what do you think?
Well, this kind of leads to the psychology sort of underpinning all of this, and there's a lot of research that shows that people who are sort of in this sort of condition, of uncertainty and insecurity, are likely to sort of cling to certain kinds of beliefs. And there's research that shows when they're misinformed and they're corrected, there's this so-called backfire effect where they cling to their beliefs all the more strongly. And it's I think it's easy, to sort of cling to those, especially when you can find sources that sort of agree with you. So I think it's a complex problem right now. I mean, there are objective conditions that make people feel insecure. And under those conditions, they then try to find security and messages, perhaps, that comfort them.
Are we failing there somehow? Are we not preparing citizens to think these things through and to ask questions?
You know, I think, I mean, if you were to sort of look at our recent history, I think you could sort of draw that conclusion. You know, that sort of unhappy diagnosis of what's happening. You know, but I think that there's some. That there's some hope in that, you know, that we've seen, and I think it usually comes from political movements, and I think I'm especially heartened by what's happened in the last year, and I think that there's the possibility that we'll sort of reformulate our politics simply because people are unhappy with the present conditions, and they're pretty media savvy. That's one thing I think that's come of this information revolution. People have become very, very savvy. These high school kids, I mean, very astute about the way television works. And so actually...
Yeah, here we are with our PhDs and we're learning something from them.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah.
So.
A lot of directions we could go with this, but what are some other issues here? I know, you mentioned the Me Too movement. Are there some other things that are going on right now that give us some insights into the wheels that are turning behind the scenes?
Yeah, I think one thing that I wanted to mention is that I also do research on race relations, and I think one thing that people have not talked about that much is that currently, for example, today they were talking about, I think the Trump administration was talking about punishing companies that produce these opioids.
Yeah.
And if I recall, the sort of deindustrialization of the cities kind of led to these horrible conditions that you find in working class black ghettos right now, which then led to all kinds of policies having to do with what's called collectively mass incarceration, and that was a war on drugs.
That goes back to the 1980s, right?
Right. Yeah. And so deindustrialization started hitting the white working class, I think, much more recently. Yeah. And then it became an opioid epidemic, so it's being treated as if it were some kind of a health crisis, when the people who are taking these drugs illegally, by the way, are not being framed as criminals. They're being framed as people, who have certain objective health conditions that need to be treated. Yeah. So there's a racial dimension to all of this as well. It's usually in the background, I think.
One of the other things that people are looking at right now that's maybe influencing this is the influence of some of these very wealthy contributors to political campaigns, like the Koch brothers, for instance. Do you see them as sort of taking advantage of this vulnerable moment here in history, or do you think this is just a case of a lot of money impacting the public debate?
Well, I think the money's always influencing the public debate.
Yeah.
And one thing that's sort of ironic about all of this is that all of the conventional political science that I've read, concluded that the public opinion has virtually no effect on public policy. It's about contributions to political campaigns. And so this political system is broken, I think. It's certainly not responsive to the popular will. And I think that explains the success of both the Trump and Sanders campaigns. And you see you're beginning to see some resistance against that, especially the rebellion against the NRA, which is the first time that I can recall.
Yeah.
People sort of pushed back against them. So I think the money is always there, or I think it's just a way of people become conscious of its influence, and I think people become very conscious of that right now.
Well, let's go back to something you brought up at the beginning as we're getting close to the end here. Mm-hmm. You talked about a kind of an existential crisis that we were going through. What brings us out of that historically? What's your take on that?
I think that we're beginning to realize that we're not in the primary positions that we were in after World War II. We see the ascendancy of China, for example, and people are becoming accustomed to that, I think, and I think that their pictures of the world perhaps are going to be revised. And I don't think that America is going to be able to sort of maintain a sort of hegemonic position anymore. I think people are going to be made a little bit more aware of the fact that America is one among other great powers. And maybe that will make our political discourse a little bit less fraught. At least I'm.
Yeah. Do you think there's another country or other countries that are as influential on us as we've been on them in the past 100 years?
Other countries that have been...
Right now, I mean, for instance, do you think China's causing us to look at the world a little bit differently, or are we going to have to adjust the way we're portraying ourselves internationally?
It's certainly affecting our foreign policy. I know that, for example, President Trump has been making references to the Chinese, in a way that, kind of almost raising them to the level of sort of equal partnership.
Yeah.
Rather than seeing them as rivals. During his campaign, I mean, he was vilifying the Chinese for sort of taking advantage of us, and now he accepts them as sort of co-equal partners almost.
Well, they invented the wall.
They sure did.
He has to admire them at least for that. So what's your next project?
Right now, I'm going back to. I'm thinking about doing a revision of a project that I worked on a number of years ago, A Black Image in the White Mind, getting a sense of our sort of state of racial thinking today. When we did that project in the 90s, we had a very different information environment from the one that we have today. We have one today that's much more complex. Yeah. And it's more, I think, about tracing ideas through a network of information sources and who shares what information with someone else. A lot of the discourse is now visible. People are much more frank about about their beliefs. That's something that was sort of hidden, I think, in the 90s.
There's been a lot of really, offensive and thoughtful rhetoric on race for a number of years. Quickly, I mean, you see that's we're getting more. You think we're getting a little bit more free in expressing ourselves?
Well, this whole idea of political correctness, that sort of came up in the 90s and the 2000s, had to do with people feeling constrained by norms. Somehow you turn a norm that has admirable goals. Don't say nasty things, or don't say nasty things openly.
Our moms told us to be nice.
Turned against people by making them feel that that's somehow constraining and authoritarian. I think that was one of Trump's appeals. He said what he wanted to say. I think people feel a lot freer to say those things, and I think it's probably good. I think it's actually not a bad thing for people to realize that that racism still exists, and that it's fairly open, and I think it can be dealt with much more honestly. I think in some respects.
Yeah, so on both cases then, we're more open, I think, with one another, and we're also seeing more open commentary in the media as well. That's all the time we have for our program. I want to thank you for coming in. Once again, this is Dr. Andrew Rojecki, and that's all the time we have for our program today. I'll see you next time.